Mercaris is the nation's leading market information service for organic and non-GMO agricultural commodities. At Mercaris.com, you can find up-to-date information on market conditions for organic and non-GMO commodities, including import and export, acreage and production estimates, and timely commodity pricing information. Visit Mercaris.com now for more information. Or for agricultural producers, visit Mercaris.com/farmer to sign up for Mercaris' free farmer plan.
This is Ryan Koory, the Director of Economics here at Mercaris, with your September U.S. Organic Commodity Market Outlook Update. With September now underway, we're looking at the beginning of harvest here in the U.S., and with that, we're getting prepared to release our September Market Outlook Update, providing kind of our first expectations around where we think U.S. organic commodity production, supply, and demand is going to be over the 2021 marketing year. Currently, what we're looking at is we're expecting somewhere around a 9% increase in organic corn production this year relative to last year. Part of that's due to we're expecting to see an improvement in yields relative to last year's yield drop-off due to a non-repeat of the weak planting conditions, challenging planting and harvesting conditions of 2019. And then in addition to that, we're also looking for a modest increase in acreage. The increase in acreage is maybe not quite as strong as we had anticipated, as it looks like we've had a reduction in operations in a few key Corn Belt states, as well as a loss of a number of acres in California. All in all, though, I think we're on pace to hit about 44.6 million bushels of organic corn production over this year's harvest, which, as I mentioned, is a 9% increase. And then looking at soybeans, soybeans look like they're going to be up even more. Currently, we're estimating we're on pace to reach a 12% year-over-year increase in U.S. organic soybean production, which puts us about 8.6 million bushels. And with soybeans, it's a little bit similar to what we were talking about with organic corn, if not better. Both corn yields and corn acres look like they're going to reach record highs this year, and that should put us in a position where U.S. supplies are pretty robust as we start this the 2021 marketing year.
Looks like some promising numbers, Ryan, for organic farmers with some good yields moving into harvest here. But what would be the risk to those projections?
Yeah, whenever we're talking about these production projections, we're really talking about a combination of two factors, and that's yields and acres. On the acre side, for both corn and soybeans, one of the risks that we see is with COVID-19 this year, we did have reports of some challenges around getting operations certified this year. And with that, we believe there's some delay in getting some paperwork filled out and submitted. As a result, some of your new operations may not be showing up in USDA data that we use as part of our basis for calculating the number of farms and the number of acres out there in the United States. If that suspicion holds true, and it turns out there are a lot more organic operations and organic acres out there that have yet to be counted, then we could see that acreage number drift up before the end of harvest. I think that's definitely one of the more salient price risks. And then looking at the yield side, organic corn yields right now, they're looking pretty good. They're not hitting record levels. We've had some places that have had some challenging growing conditions. You're talking about some of the issues we saw in Iowa and in Texas and Ohio, which are kind of putting a cap on yields. If yields perform a little bit worse than what we're currently expecting, which according to the latest USDA WASDE, the September WASDE, they revised down their U.S. estimates again. So that appears like that may be a risk for our yield estimates. So that could trim that top end on corn. But from a corn supply perspective, I think the risk is more in terms of more supply than less from that acreage number. And then similarly on soybeans, soybeans on the yield side, we're talking record yields this year. And when you're talking record yields, it could be record yields, or it could, fail to meet expectations. Similarly on soybeans, I think the big risk there is even more supply than we're currently talking. We're expecting a 12% year-over-year increase, If both that acreage number and that yield number outperform our current expectations, well, you could be quickly put yourself in a 15% year-over-year increase. And that could change your price outlook for this year pretty substantially, pretty quickly. So switching gears and talking about imports a little bit, one of the surprising things over the month of August is the pace of U.S. organic corn imports actually slowed down relative to what we were expecting. A seasonal trend that we tend to see with organic corn imports and soybean imports as well is imports from the country of Argentina tend to drop off over the summer months, the second quarter and early third quarter of the year, and then pick up at the end of the third quarter and into harvest. And we began to see a little bit of that in July, and we expected August to show additional gains, and it turns out those weren't the case. And over the month of August, we estimate U.S. organic corn imports fell below 2,000 metric tons, which is the lowest organic corn imports for the month of August we have on record. Looking at the crack corn side of things, crack corn pretty well continued along with the expectations of what we had going into August. More or less, U.S. organic crack corn imports are coming in modestly lower year-over-year over the 1920 marketing year. And that's kind of a combination of two factors. One of those being, an increased reliance on the Black Sea region as the only source that we really get organic crack corn imports from, as well as the fact that within U.S. markets, whether you're looking at soybeans or you're looking at corn, crack corn, the trend of imports from the Black Sea region just continues to decline in the United States. And so that's kind of a factor that's been keeping a cap on those imports over this year. So overall, for the marketing year, for the 1920 marketing year, we're looking at organic corn imports to come in or just a little bit below aggregated cracked and whole corn imports. Thinking about soybeans pretty well hit right in line with our expectations. Whole bean imports came in just a little bit below where they were the prior year, down about 17% year over year, which isn't too much off of where we were kind of expecting beans to come in. Overall, organic soybean imports for the 1920 marketing year are coming in higher year over year, kind of offsetting what we're seeing in terms of a decline in soybean meal imports. Thinking back about what soybean meal imports did over this past marketing year, August is kind of a reflection of that. They came in a little bit lower year over year, and we're seeing a trend somewhat similar to what we talked about in crack corn. It's the combination of an increase in reliance on a single source, it being India with soybean meal. But with soybean meal this year, we actually also saw a disruption to the flow of imports following COVID-19 disrupting Indian ports. So overall, the level of U.S. organic soybean meal imports over this past marketing year was just slightly down year over year.
So it sounds like overall imports of organic grain into the U.S. are either steady or down quite significantly in the corn case. Is that just this year with the supply chain being disrupted by COVID-19? Or is there something else happening here overall within the market, within the import market?
Yeah, I think that kind of depends on which imports you're talking about. If you're talking about organic corn imports, I think this is a return to trend. Over 18-19, we saw an increase in U.S. organic corn imports, and I think a lot of that increase was expectation of a reduced harvest that year. Prior to that, we were basically saw lower year-over-year organic crack corn imports for about 2 years in a row, and then we had 1 year higher, and now we're lower again this year, and I think that's a return to trend. And if you kind of think about that trend, what it might mean going into the next year, I think that this is something we're going to continue to see traveling into 2021, particularly if we do have such a large organic corn crop here in the U.S. We'll probably see those imports continue to trend a little bit lower. Soybeans are a little bit of a different story. We actually have been seeing a growing trend in organic soybean meal imports over the last several years. So over this past 1920 marketing year, I would have expected to see soybean meal imports in modestly higher, not substantially, but modestly, had it not been for the fact that COVID-19 had disrupted the flow of exports out of India, thus impacting U.S. imports from that country. And I think that's a major factor of why we saw those imports dip year to year. Which means if we're looking at the 2021 marketing year, if we don't repeat those disruptions, we may see those soybean meal imports return, back to those 18-19 levels, up again modestly year over year. And then finally, talking about whole soybean imports. Whole soybean imports have been a bit of a wild market to watch over this past year because there's just been a absolute shift in import trends. We've talked about this before, but really India Russia and Argentina emerged as the two largest suppliers by far. I believe they accounted for somewhere around 65% of all U.S. organic soybean imports this past year. And with that, it's a question of why did those, what's driving their emergence and how much room do they have to expand their share of the U.S. market? When you're looking at what's driving Argentina's emergence, it's kind of been a bit of a slow build where a lot of people who are importers of organic soybeans have shifted market preference away from the Black Sea region and have rebuilt supply chains out of Argentina. That's kind of led to that. And then when you're looking at Russia, the ramp up in Russian imports from Russia seems to be somewhat offsetting the decline in imports from the Black Sea region. So it could just be a port of preference shift for imports from that part of the world. So if we think about 2021, do they have room to move higher? Potentially modestly. The risk factor there, again, being kind of like corn, just how big will this U.S. soybean crop be? If it holds its current trend or exceeds our current expectations, then that could really limit the upside for imports of whole beans over this next year as well.
It sounds similar to 2018, and you kind of touched on it with the corn market, where we had a very good yield in 2018. And then 2019 expectations were low on harvest, but I think some of the inventories from 2018 were carried over into 2019, and actually in 2020 here we are seeing still some of the 2008 inventory carry over. So it may be a good sign here with acres and yields being up that imports for domestic farmers, I should say, that yields or that imports are being held at bay to try and at least give some support to a price.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we like to see and we want to continue to see within the U.S. organic market in general is a continued expansion of U.S. production and its ability to satisfy U.S. demand, so that the dollars that are being spent on purchasing organic feed are going back into organic crop production in the U.S. and continue to expand this industry. So looking at organic livestock over the month of August, in a lot of ways, August looks very similar to what we were talking about back in July. Organic dairy tends to hold pretty steady with its current production level, somewhere just slightly above where we were in 2019. Organic broiler has been a bit of a roller coaster ride this year, as we've talked about, with that slowdown in slaughter over COVID-19 and then that ramp up immediately following, but things have since settled back down, and we're somewhere around 1% to 2% higher year over year in terms of organic broiler slaughter. That's we're closing out the 1920 marketing year. The one that has actually been the most exciting to watch and the most dynamic is organic turkey slaughter. And on the organic turkey slaughter, this past marketing year saw an explosion in the rate of organic turkey production. If we look back at August of 2019, we saw that U.S. organic turkey slaughter was averaging somewhere around 4.2 thousand head per day. This past August of 2020, that number is actually averaging somewhere closer to 13.2 thousand. So a substantial increase in that organic turkey throughput, which if we maintain this current turkey slaughter level and somewhere around our current broiler production level, that's about 1% to 2% more organic broiler slaughter over this 2021 marketing year, and potentially somewhere around 25 to 30% more organic turkey slaughter. So that's positive on the demand side for the organic crops in the U.S. The other thing that I may be watching out for is once we get into the last part of this current marketing year, if we have a situation where organic corn prices and organic feed prices remain low, and we continue to see consumer demand trends on their current bent where consumers are eating more organic products and eating more food at home, perhaps that starts to create a situation in which organic dairy margins start to improve. And if we start to see that really start to manifest by next spring and last over several months into next year. Maybe by the time we look at the end of the 2021 marketing year, maybe the early 2022 marketing year, maybe we can start to see an opportunity where there's room for organic dairy production to expand, but that's kind of predicated on a whole bunch of maybes. But I think it's definitely something to watch as, consumer demand increases and there's risk of lower prices over this marketing year.
Just a comment on the dairy market would be we sure hope that there would be expanded demand for organic dairy products, but the organic dairy industry certainly has been in a downturn for the last 4 years with expanded supplies affecting the overall market and driving prices down. So we would certainly hope that margins would increase. Farmers are in need of that. But like you said, there's a whole lot of maybes there.
Yeah, absolutely. We always try to look for the bright spot, but it's important to keep it in context as well.
And then just real quick, any idea where that increase in turkey slaughter is coming from?
Yeah, that's quite the question. And we've spent quite a bit of research over the past week trying to determine exactly where this increase in slaughter is originating. We do know that this past year has seen the expansion of a few different lines of mixed meat products, products that are taking organic poultry meat essentially, as well as other protein sources, whether they be beans or peas and some situations grains, and producing things like meatballs and hamburger patties. And those have been new product lines, and so those are certainly new avenues of consumer demand for organic meat. But, to substantiate going from 4.2 thousand to 13.2 thousand, you can't hardly call that enough to be that catalyst. A lot of it is likely due to the fact that we have seen an increase in consumer demand this year, particularly for proteins coming through grocery stores. Looking into it, we don't really see any evidence, and we haven't heard any reporting in terms of substantial expansion or newly built organic turkey processing facilities. So it's likely these birds are being passed through conventional lines that have been cleaned up and are using their organic certification, because many poultry processing lines are also organic certified. They'll switch between running conventional and organic depending on what lines they're running. So it's likely that it's not going through new capacity, it's going through that existing capacity. One of the unfortunate things is we don't have a strong pipeline in terms of connection with organic livestock producers, broiler producers, or turkey producers. So I haven't heard a lot of feedback in terms of people signing new grower contracts for organic turkeys. But all that said, clearly there's been an uptick in slaughter, so we must be sourcing these birds from somewhere. So we must be growing them here in the U.S. because I don't know of many places that export whole live birds to the U.S. So it's definitely something we're going to keep an eye on and try to understand where this new supply is coming from so that we can kind of understand whether or not it's going to persist. But, if we can maintain this current slaughter level, this 13.2 average over this next marketing year, and even not even talking any continued growth, that gives you room for some pretty substantial increase in turkey production, and that should translate into some pretty good demand growth on livestock feed. So finally, turning back towards prices, unfortunately, over the month of September, we saw that support that corn markets had built up at the end of July and into August, it backs back off. Over the 2-week period ending September 15th, the Mercaris market price survey for U.S. delivered organic feed-grade corn averaged $7.61 per bushel, which puts prices back down around the May-June price range. Organic feed wheat markets pretty well followed organic corn markets, ending that same September 5th time period at $7.60 a bushel. And then looking at organic feed-grade soybeans, actually they continued to hold on to that August strength and added to it over the other part of September, with feed-grade soybeans coming in at $21.25 per bushel over that 2 weeks ending September 5th, which is up about $1 from the start of August.
Well, as we talked about earlier, the corn price support, I guess, isn't entirely surprising to see that go away with the anticipated good harvest, and still talking about 2018 inventory being held on hand or being available for sale. What would be your explanation for why the bean price would be being held up?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing we saw really emerge over this past marketing year, and it's only strengthened. Organic soybeans have held up much better than organic corn and organic feed grade wheat. And, I think it's really a twofold thing. One, in the United States, we just produce so much more corn than we do soybeans. We talked about it before. We're expecting about 44.6 million bushels of corn versus 8.6 million bushels of soybeans. So a larger domestic supply definitely weighs more on corn markets than it does on soybean markets. And then the other factor that's likely contributing is the fact that organic poultry demand has been the big driver of livestock feed demand for multiple years in a row now. And particularly with turkeys becoming a substantial form of growth over this past year and likely into this next, an organic turkey ration just requires a higher percentage of protein relative to grains than a lot of your other feed rations, particularly if you're looking at dairy. And so I think that's part of why you're able to see soybeans hold their price better than corns have, partially because that domestic supply situation is larger for organic corn. And also the source of organic feed demand, it just is pushing the balance more towards soybeans and less towards corn.
Well, why don't we wrap up here, Ryan, with as we move into the 2020-2021 marketing year, what's your outlook for prices?
Yeah, if I look at this marketing year, I'd like to call it even, and I think there's room for prices to maybe get a little bit of support if we get lucky breaks. If I try to count up what I think might be the bullish factors. One, we are continuing to see expansion in broiler production, and two, it looks like organic turkey production is going to do really well this year. Another thing that may wind up coming in towards the end of this marketing year is I recently read an article that Bell & Evans is gearing up to double their organic broiler slaughtering processing capacity. So that could again add to that demand side. And so we could see some more demand side factors adding some support to prices. On top of that, one of the blind spots we do have within the organic industries, we just don't have a good measure of what grain stocks on hand look like. We do know that we started this past marketing year with well above average grain on hand, particularly corn, and that's really what's weighed down prices. We do believe that we've worked through some of that supply, and so markets should be tightening up from that perspective. If we get a situation in which feed demand outperforms what we're currently expecting, and grain markets are actually tightening up a little bit, then we could see, if this crop stays kind of on pace where we are, maybe not so much price gains, but maybe a floor put under prices to kind of keep them from dropping too much lower. Conversely, we talk about, feed demand being a big part of this, and even if it does hold up, we don't know how much grain is on hand, and it could actually be a lot larger. As you mentioned, there's still 2018 corn sitting out there. And then when we're talking about our production outlook, there is risk of production pushing even higher, particularly on the acreage side. And so if you take, we've got more grain out there than we realize, kind of like what we started this past marketing year with. Production comes in higher than we were expecting, and then imports being the X factor. If imports should push higher for whatever reason, that could push that supply position and really push us in a negative price territory. I'd like to look at it and have optimism that maybe prices will get a floor under them by the time harvest is over. But I think, probably the more pertinent risk to be aware of is the fact that the supply position could get a lot bigger, and that could wind up being bearish for prices.
Well, that certainly gives us a lot to watch here moving forward, but very interesting report this month, Ryan, and really appreciate your time, and hope everybody will tune in October for another update. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian.